Now we're going to go over how the Columbian Exchange, how the Atlantic Basin impacted, or excuse me, the Atlantic trade impacted Africa. And we're going to spend most of our time here in 4.1, Roman numeral 5, looking at how food crops impact Africa. And then we're also going to be focusing on the social impact, which is more 4.2 Roman numeral 2. So during this time period, it's pretty remarkable that the population of Africa increased because of the huge export of slaves. Trade brought new food crops to Africa, and the most important was a crop called manioc. And as you can see here, manioc looks kind of like a long sweet potato, but it's made into this kind of mash, almost like actually a potato. And you can also use it to make bread, and it becomes a big staple part of every meal. So it's basically the starch and the calories. They use palm oil a lot of times to give it more calories. And I'll show you a map in just a second of how much the population of Africa increased. However, like I referenced in the first slide, there was a gender imbalance in who was being enslaved. A lot of slaves were men. And this led to, in a lot of places, there being less men in Africa and many more women. Now, marriage and family were still incredibly important in Africa, and so in order to rectify this, many societies started to put more of an emphasis on polygamy. Because if you wanted to get married, if you wanted to have a family, there were not enough men for every woman to marry one man. It was just impossible with the way things went with the slave trade. Other areas were torn by increased warfare. Coastal kingdoms, if you look at the way the slave trade worked, actually benefited from the slave trade in terms of money and power. So on the coast, they would send raiding parties into the interior, and this created a lot of friction between societies. So there were those who were participating in the slave trade as people who were gathering slaves, and then there were those who were actually being enslaved. And this type of tension really destabilized Africa, many parts of Africa, excuse me. Here we can see the population growth of Africa. In the 3 centuries after 1500, the population rises from 34 million to 60 million. And this is during the height of the slave trade, when more than 55,000 Africans are being exported each year. So in this section, we're going to start to take a look at what the slave trade looked like both in Africa and once the Europeans got involved. So we're going to be focusing on key concepts 4.21b and 4.21c and d. Slavery has played a role in the human experience for thousands of years, and African societies definitely have suffered disproportionately in that. But there are 2 factors that lead to that, and those 2 factors are law and the makeup of society in Africa. These combine to make African slavery very unique. Since private ownership of land was not recognized in Africa, that led to slavery being a sign of wealth. Slaves could also be brought into a kinship group and receive freedom and recognition within a generation. So if you wanted to increase your family, you could, or increase your clan size, you could theoretically get slaves to do that. So you could be enslaved for one or less generation. During the centuries before the arrival of Europeans, about 10 million Africans had already passed through especially the trans-Saharan trade routes and the Indian Ocean basin into the Islamic world. However, as we will get into next, the Europeans, led by the Portuguese in the 15th century, dwarfed those trading networks.